I was at a ripe young age where being left home alone was exciting. I was like 13, and my parents had just recently started entrusting me to be home alone overnight. The only condition was I couldn't leave the house or have anyone over, but I was fine with that. Something about being able to blast my music or video games without my dad yelling at me was just exhilarating. To make things even better, it was a rainy night, which turned into a thunderstorm. I sat outside under the awning for a while, watching the thunderstorm as I like to do. I've always loved thunderstorms as they just make staying in so much cozier. After a while of watching the storm, I moved my Xbox from my room to the downstairs den TV. My dad's huge flat-screen TV with the Bose sound system. Oh! The only time I'd get to game on there was when I was home alone, and I loved it. The den was a half flight of stairs down from the living room level, and it was level with the backyard. So the backyard door was in the den. I'm describing the house in past tense because I moved out, but my parents still live there. So I was playing Black Ops down in the den, with the volume blasting. I was playing online multiplayer in a party with my friend Cody. I had some crappy old headset, where the only audio you could hear was other people in the lobby and game talking. For a 13-year-old standards, it was the perfect night. Until something interrupted my peace. The sound of the doorbell. It was past 9:00 by then. I told Cody the doorbell rang, and he said I should go check and see who it was. I wondered if maybe it was my parents back home early, but they had the keys, so they wouldn't ring the doorbell. I hid in a spot in the game where I wouldn't get killed, then went upstairs to the front door, asking, "Who's there?" I didn't realize how much of a mistake that would be. A male's voice on the other side said, "I need to use a phone." I didn't know what to do, so I didn't answer and went back downstairs. But it was too late. The damage was done, and I let whoever was out there know I was home. I told Cody about it, and his reaction was simply, "Yo, what the?" He agreed with me that I shouldn't open the door, but the doorbell rang again. Cody said to ignore it. That was the last time I heard the doorbell. And after a while, I relaxed again, as it seemed whoever was out there had left. I can't explain the roller coaster of emotions I felt that night. One moment I'm on edge, the next I'm relaxed, and back into the fantasy world of my game. And then, as I was most at ease, I heard something to my right, and when I looked, I saw the back door closing, and some tall man stepping inside. It was not my dad. It was a stranger. I dropped the controller and ran for the office door, and the cord to the headset quickly ripped out of the controller. I made it to the office and slammed the door shut, and I'm by no means exaggerating when I say the second after I locked the door handle aggressively shook as the man on the other side tried opening the door. The office had two doors in it, one that led to the den and one that led to the garage. My only chance to escape the house was to go through the garage. But before even moving, I just stood still, waiting for something to happen on the other side of the door. Seconds felt like minutes. The man knocked on the door and said, "Little boy, I just need to use your phone." I was stranded out in the rain. His knocks turned to pounds as his voice got louder and angrier sounding. It gradually turned to yelling and pounding. He yelled, "Open the door, you little," as it sounded like he was literally trying to break down the door. I had no choice but to go through the garage. I pressed the button to open the garage door, and it was so loud and slow to open that I prayed the man couldn't hear it. As soon as it was up about halfway, I crawled under and ran through the storm, a few doors down to our neighbor Julian's house, who I knew well because I used to play with his dog, Copper, when I was little. I heard Copper barking as I rang the bell, looking back at my house, hoping not to see someone coming down the block. Julian opened the door, and I ran into his arms, begging him for help, as his wife came out of the kitchen in confusion. When I told them of the break-in, their demeanors instantly changed. Julian got the police on the phone and handled getting them to my parents' house. It was a long, long wait before the police were outside, and Steve and I went out to them. I told them the same thing I told Steve, and after they asked which door was unlocked, I said the garage. A couple of them went through the garage into the house, and after maybe 5 minutes they came outside with a man in handcuffs. They made sure he didn't see my face. After he was in a police car, they asked me if I knew that man, and I said no, of course. I don't know that man. He had been telling the officers that this was his house, and that I was his son. I could tell he was drunk or high or just generally crazy, based on the things he was yelling and the way he was acting. He was brought to jail, and my parents had to be contacted regarding how they wished to proceed, and they pressed charges. His name was John McCarty. He got charged for, I believe, criminal trespass. It didn't make me feel any safer that that man would one day be out and know where I lived. Thankfully, it was just a random chance encounter. I don't believe he specifically targeted me or our house. So whenever he was released, he didn't come back. I never thought in a million years that anything truly horrific would ever happen to me. I'm an average person with a boring enough life that anything out of the ordinary was really out of the ordinary. This is why I was always okay with watching or listening to those creepypasta and true horror stories on YouTube. I still do watch them often. But after my own experience, these stories scared me in a whole new way. It was late at night, I'd say around 4:00 a.m. But I don't really know for sure. And everyone else in my house was asleep. My mother and both of my grandparents. For the past 2 months or so, we get at least one major thunderstorm per week. And it just so happened that this one decided to start earlier that night. Now, I always enjoy a good thunderstorm, especially at night when you can go sit by the window and just watch the lightning. But something about the wind of them always creeped me out. Maybe the fact that it could be soft or deafening and switch between the two almost instantly. But for some reason, wind has always given me huge creeps. Now, this night's thunderstorm was one of the worst we'd had in a long time. It sounded like rocks were hitting my window all night. But I was enjoying listening to it while I browsed Reddit as I do, when all of a sudden, the power went out in the blink of an eye. This was kind of creepy, but I didn't really mind because I had my data and a decent charge on my phone, so I continued browsing. After a little while, I started to get tired, so I figured it was time to shut my phone off and get some sleep. I placed it on the side table next to me and rolled over to go to sleep. I guess I passed out shortly after because I don't remember anything in between the rain hammering at my window and the eerie silence of a soft wind outside. I assumed the rain stopped while I was asleep. I rolled over and started to get up, realizing my phone wasn't there anymore, which was odd because I specifically remembered putting it next to me. But what was even stranger was the fact that I hadn't woken up until then. Normally, I wake up around 3 or 4 times throughout the night. My sleep habits are horrible, but this night was an odd exception to that. This thought alone was enough to give me goosebumps. The room was completely silent, and the only noise to be heard was a slight squeak from a floorboard behind me. The slight squeak from the floorboard behind me froze me in place. My heart started pounding in my chest as I lay there, terrified to move. I tried convincing myself that it was just the house settling or something harmless. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Slowly, I turned over to face the direction of the sound, my eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. I couldn't see much, just vague shapes in the dim light that filtered in from outside. But there was something that seemed out of place. In the corner of my room, near the door, I saw a dark figure standing still. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that maybe it was just a shadow cast by the storm outside. But the more I stared, the more I realized that the shape was too distinct to be a shadow. It had a human form, tall and slender, with its head slightly tilted as if it was watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but I was too terrified to make a sound. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silently, as if it was waiting for something. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that when I opened them again, it would be gone. But when I dared to peek, it was still there. Closer this time, maybe a few feet away from my bed. Panic set in. I threw the blankets over my head, hoping to block out the sight of the figure. I fumbled around under the covers, reaching for my phone, but I couldn't find it. The realization hit me that my phone was gone, taken by whoever or whatever was in my room. My mind raced with fear and confusion. I didn't know if I should stay hidden or make a run for the door. Every nerve in my body was on edge. Then I heard it, a raspy whisper coming from just beside my bed. "Don't move," the voice hissed. It was a low, chilling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I clenched the blankets tighter around me, praying that this was all a nightmare, that I would wake up any second. But the voice spoke again, this time even closer. "I can see you." I couldn't take it anymore. With a burst of adrenaline, I threw the blankets off me and bolted out of bed. I didn't care what was standing in the dark. My only thought was to get out of the room as fast as I could. I sprinted toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears, and flung it open. I ran down the hallway past the silent rooms where my mother and grandparents slept, and headed for the stairs. As I descended, I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, following me down. I didn't dare look back. I kept running until I reached the front door, yanking it open and bursting out into the storm. The rain soaked me instantly, but I didn't care. I ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on the door in a panic. After what felt like an eternity, they answered, their concerned faces illuminated by the glow of a flashlight. I told them everything, my voice shaking as I described the figure in my room and the whispers I had heard. They called the police, who arrived a short while later. I waited inside the neighbor's house, too scared to return to my own. When the police searched my house, they found no sign of forced entry and no one hiding inside. But they did find my phone, sitting in the middle of my bedroom floor as if it had been placed there intentionally. The officers chalked it up to a bad dream, maybe sleep paralysis, or my imagination running wild. But I knew what I had seen and heard. Someone, or something, had been in my room that night. And the scariest part was, I had no idea how they got in or where they went. To this day, I still get chills when I think about that night. I no longer feel safe in my own home, and every creak of the floorboards sends my heart racing. I sleep with the lights on now, and I keep my phone close at hand. But no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in my room that night is still out there, waiting for another opportunity to strike. The days that followed were some of the longest and most agonizing of my life. I couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung over me, like a dark cloud waiting to unleash another storm. Even in broad daylight, I felt uneasy, glancing over my shoulder constantly, as though that shadowy figure might appear out of thin air. I tried talking to my mother about it, but she dismissed my fears as just a bad dream. She didn't understand. No one did. My grandparents were even less concerned, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But how could they be so calm? Every night I lay awake, my eyes darting around the room, unable to trust the dark corners or the sounds in the night. I started having nightmares. They were always the same. I was back in my room, paralyzed in bed, while the figure stood over me, its breath warm and foul against my face. In the dreams, it never spoke, but its presence was suffocating, a silent, inescapable terror that left me gasping for air when I awoke. Then, strange things started happening around the house. At first, it was small things. Doors that I was sure I had closed would be wide open in the morning, or objects would be out of place, as though someone had been rummaging through my belongings. My mother insisted that I must have been sleepwalking, but I had never done anything like that before. The worst part was that I could feel it, the presence, the same one from that night. Even when I was alone, I had this constant, gnawing sensation that I was being watched. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was always just beyond my field of vision, lurking in the shadows, teasing me with its near invisibility. One evening, I came home late from school. The house was unusually quiet, almost too quiet. My mother had gone out for the night, and my grandparents were fast asleep in their room. I tried to distract myself with homework, but the silence was oppressive, making it hard to focus. Every little noise, every creak of the old house set me on edge. And then I heard it again, that unmistakable creak from the floorboard. The same one that had woken me up that night. My heart leapt into my throat. It came from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. Slowly I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me as I moved toward the door. With trembling hands, I reached for the knob, my breath shallow and quick. I opened the door just a crack, peeking out into the dimly lit hallway. At first, I saw nothing, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed it. Movement. Just barely visible at the end of the hall. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. The figure was back. It stood there, its tall, dark silhouette blending with the shadows. This time, I didn't wait for it to get closer. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away as quickly as I could. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do? Where could I go? The doorknob rattled. I froze, watching in horror as the knob twisted slowly, as if someone was trying to open the door from the other side. My entire body was trembling. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to call the police, but the signal was weak, and the call wouldn't go through. The rattling stopped, and there was silence again. I held my breath, listening intently for any sign of movement, but the only sound was the rapid beating of my heart. For a long moment, nothing happened, and I started to wonder if maybe it had gone away. And then, bang! Something heavy slammed against the door, making me jump back in terror. The wood splintered slightly under the force, and I could hear a low, guttural sound, like breathing. No growling coming from the other side. I pressed myself against the far wall, tears streaming down my face as I prayed for it to stop. My phone slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor, but I was too terrified to pick it up. The banging continued, growing louder and more aggressive with each hit. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence fell over the room once more, thick and suffocating. I stayed where I was, too afraid to move, barely daring to breathe. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and still, nothing happened. Slowly, cautiously, I edged toward the door, pressing my ear against it to listen. There was no sound. No growling, no movement, nothing. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I unlocked the door and pulled it open just a fraction, peering into the hallway. The figure was gone. The only thing left behind was a faint, dark stain on the floorboards outside my room. Something thick and viscous that glistened in the dim light. I didn't dare touch it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner of my room, clutching my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. The next morning, I tried to explain what had happened to my mother, but she looked at me like I was losing my mind. Even the stain on the floor had disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. I don't know what that thing was, or why it was tormenting me, but I do know one thing: it's not gone. Not really. It's still out there, watching, waiting, and one day, it will come back. And this time, I might not be so lucky. The days after that final encounter passed in a haze of dread and confusion. I became more withdrawn, barely able to focus on school or even basic conversations with my family. Every noise in the house felt like an omen, and every shadow seemed alive with menace. My sleep became fitful and fragmented, and dark circles formed under my eyes from the constant exhaustion. Yet, nothing else happened. No more growling, no more banging on my door. But that didn't bring me comfort. It only made the anticipation worse. One day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to do something, anything, to find out what was haunting me. I began digging into the history of the house, researching any strange occurrences or past residents that might offer some explanation for what I'd been experiencing. I spent hours at the local library, combing through old records, newspapers, and any information I could get my hands on. That's when I found something. Buried deep within an old newspaper archive was an article from decades ago, long before my grandparents had moved in. It described a man who had lived in the house, a recluse, someone the neighbors described as off, though no one really knew him well. According to the article, the man had been found dead inside the house under mysterious circumstances. His body had been discovered by a relative who hadn't heard from him in weeks, and the police ruled it an accident, though the exact details were unclear. But there was something about the man that stood out to me: his name. His name was the same as my grandfather's. Not exactly, but close enough to make me pause. Could it be a relative? Maybe. But no one in my family had ever mentioned him. It was as though he had been erased from their memories. Or maybe they never knew about him at all. The article said nothing about hauntings or spirits, but something in my gut told me that this man, this shadow of the past, was connected to what I had been experiencing. I took my discovery to my grandparents, hoping that maybe they would have some answers, some clue that could explain what was happening. My grandmother seemed puzzled by the name, but dismissed it as a coincidence. My grandfather, however, grew strangely quiet, a shadow passing over his face. He brushed off my questions, insisting that I stop looking into things that don't concern me. But I could see it in his eyes. He knew something. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to stop thinking about the man from the article. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? Why was he haunting me? What did he want? But as much as I tried to piece it together, I couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that something dark had been left behind in this house, something that had never fully departed. Then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. A faint creak from the hallway. My heart began to race, and I sat up, listening intently. For a moment, everything was still. But then came another sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to send chills down my spine. I slowly climbed out of bed, my legs shaking beneath me, and crept toward the door. My hand hovered over the knob, hesitating. Part of me wanted to lock it and hide under the covers, but another part of me, maybe the part that had been worn down by weeks of terror, needed to know. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick, like something unseen was standing just out of sight. I took a cautious step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, just as I reached the end of the hall, I saw it again. The dark, shadowy figure standing in the corner near the stair. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes, its skeletal hand resting on the banister. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen in place, trapped in its gaze. Then, slowly, the figure lifted its hand and pointed down the stairs, its long finger directing me towards something unseen. My breath hitched as I stared at it, my mind screaming at me to run. But something deep inside urged me forward. I took a step toward the stairs, then another, my feet moving of their own accord. As I descended, the figure remained motionless, its dark form fading into the shadows behind me. When I reached the bottom, I saw what it had been pointing. An old, heavy door that led to the basement. I had never liked the basement. It always felt cold and unwelcoming, a place that seemed forgotten by time. But now, standing before it, I knew that whatever had been haunting me, whatever presence I had felt all these weeks, was down there. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel the weight of something watching me, pressing down on me like a physical force. But I couldn't turn back now. I had come too far. The door creaked open, revealing the darkened stairwell that led into the basement. A foul smell wafted up from below, and I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped down into the darkness. The basement was damp and cluttered, filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes. The faint light from a single hanging bulb flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. But it wasn't the basement itself that made my skin crawl. It was the presence. I could feel it all around me, thick and oppressive, like a suffocating fog. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the figure, but it was nowhere to be seen. Instead, my gaze was drawn to something in the corner of the room. A small, dusty mirror propped up against the wall. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to walk toward it. As I approached, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. When I reached the mirror, I hesitated for a moment, then wiped away the dust with the sleeve of my shirt. And that's when I saw it. In the reflection, standing right behind me, was the figure. Its face was clearer now, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. It raised its hand slowly, pointing once again, this time directly at me. I screamed and spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. But I knew deep down that this wasn't the end. The haunting wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It would be back. And next time, I might not escape so easily